Hello once again everyone, my name is TCAmber and this is another Maya tutorial. Today I'll be covering the very basics of rigging in Maya 2017. This will include FK versus IK, set-driven keys, and blend shapes. It's important to note that these are all basic concepts that can be used in different rigging setups, and I just hope this tutorial will help you decide which is best for your project. So let's get started. Okay, so first I want to go over FK versus IK. So to do that, let's go to our rigging menu, over to our rigging tab, and create some joints. Go to the front view very quickly, create 1, 2, 3, and let's create another set of 3. 1, 2, 3. And this is your typical setup for either an arm or a leg, whereas this would be our shoulder, elbow, and wrist, or our hip, our knee, and our ankle. First things first, we want to make sure that we always name everything. It's very important to always name your joints, your controllers, your geometry, absolutely everything. It makes it easier to pass on your file to either another rigger or an animator or anybody else to help with troubleshooting. It's faster to find things when you know exactly what they're labeled. So we're going to call this first joint our L underscore shoulder. The next one we'll call L underscore elbow. And the last one we'll call L underscore wrist. And then we can repeat the same on the other side, except now you can't have two of the same things. So R underscore shoulder, R underscore elbow. Oops. And last, R underscore wrist. Okay, so we're going to have our left one here be our FK setup and our right one here be our IK setup. To demonstrate the FK, let's go ahead and create a couple curves. Just bring them up here. We'll flip them around. Do say 90 and 90. Oops, my mistake. And 90. Okay, let's just bring it over to here. Control D or Command D if you're on a Mac to duplicate it. And we'll duplicate it once more over to shoulder. Go ahead and drag select all three controllers, and because we've been duplicating, we want to make sure that we delete our history. Of course, once again, we need to name things. So we're going to call this L underscore shoulder CTRL. With the elbow, we're going to call it L underscore elbow CTRL and L wrist CTRL. As you can see, it's the same naming convention that we used for the joints. So L underscore shoulder is now L underscore shoulder CTRL. Now for an FK system, we need to make it so that all of these controllers here are going to manipulate their corresponding joint. So the shoulder controller will control the shoulder joint, elbow controller to elbow joint, and wrist controller to wrist joint. So how we want to do this first is select all of our controllers, go over to Modify and Freeze Transformations, and then go to Windows, General Editors, and our Connection Editor. Here in our Connection Editor, we're going to be able to say that our controller here in the shoulder, whenever it translates, rotates, or scales, is going to also control the shoulder joint, which in it translates, rotates, or it scales. But just for this demonstration, we're just going to go with rotate. So select the controller and load it into the left, and the joint and load it into the right. And we're going to say whenever this controller rotates X, the shoulder will also rotate X. Same for Y and Z. We can test this out now by if we move this controller. You can see now it's also controlling the shoulder joint wherever it rotates. We can now do the same with the elbow and the wrist very quickly. So we'll say elbow controller here on the left, elbow joint here on the right, open up its rotates, X to X, Y to Y, and then Z to Z. Beautiful. We'll make sure it works. You can even just click on the joint here and you'll see that its rotates over here are now yellowed out, which is just Maya's way of saying, hey, I'm being controlled by something else other than myself. Okay, so now we can go back to our wrist and load that left, the joint on the right, open the rotates, X to X. Oops, I messed up a little bit. Let's try that again. Load that in the left, load this in the right, Open only the rotates. We didn't need the translates on that last one. X to X, Y to Y, and Z to Z. Click off, and now it's also rotating. Now, just because this wrist is our end joint, that's the only reason you're not really going to see any effect when it's rotating. You would never want to rig an end joint anyhow, but just for this demonstration, if there was a hand attached, it would also be rotating along with the controller. Now, common sense would say that when I rotate here in the shoulder, it's going to rotate the elbow and the wrist. And yeah, common sense is right, but you see that our controllers are not following our elbows and our wrist. They're certainly still manipulating them, as you can see here, but they're not following through, and that's very messy and it's just a little wonky. So what we need to do is we need to create a parent-child relationship between the controllers. The easiest, fastest way to do this is we'll select our wrist controller, and we want the elbow to be the parent of our wrist. So wrist, we can middle mouse drag into the elbow, and then we can middle mouse drag the elbow into the shoulder. So now you'll see that our shoulder joint, elbow, wrist, here in our joint section matches the shoulder elbow controllers in this section. So now when we rotate our left shoulder, it also rotates not only the joints but also the controllers. And then we can move the elbow here and so on and so forth. I like to think of forward kinematics as the idea of a family system. When you see the forward kinematic system, the parents control the destiny of the child or wherever it's going. The parents and their decisions, like rotating left to right, for instance, ultimately affect the child or any children down the line. So the shoulder parent affects the elbow and the wrist child, and the elbow parent controls its wrist child, all the way down the hierarchy. So I like to remember FK as family kinematics, where the child is affected by the parent's role. Next, let's go over and deal with our inverse kinematic system. The inverse kinematic system is going to be the opposite of the forward kinematic system. In inverse kinematics, the child is going to affect the relationship of the parents. So when we set up our system, I'll be able to move this child joint, and the parents will have to manipulate themselves to match wherever the child is going. In this way, I like to think of the IK system as the independent kid-ematic system, where the independent child controls where the parents go. Before we start, we want to set our preferred angle. So let's pretend again like this is our arm. So if we want to bend the shoulder down and bring the elbow up, we want it to bend just like this, like a natural human arm would. So now that we manipulate the shoulder and the elbow to kind of match the bend that we want to have once we move the child around, we're going to click on that. We're going to go to skeleton, and we're going to say set preferred angle. And that's going to be the preferred angle, so whenever we move the child in or out, this is the way the elbow is going to bend. It's not going to bend up, it's not going to bend to the side, it's going to bend straight down. So let's go ahead, we'll get our connection out of the way. We'll zero out our rotates here. And now we need to set our IK handle. So in our rigging menu, we'll go to our rigging tab, and we'll select this here. It's called Create IK Handle. First, it's going to ask us to set the point for the start joint of the handle. So that's going to be in our wrist, and the end joint will be here in our shoulder. Now immediately you see this thick white line going all the way down, accompanied by another smaller green line. That's just showing us where our elbow is going to bend, where we set our preferred angle. So if it was shooting out to the left here or shooting up, we would know that as soon as we move this IK handle, that's the angle that the whole joint system is going to bend towards. But here we see our IK handle. We can move it up, move it in, around. You see now this whole arm is interacting like a human arm would. That wherever this hand goes and stretches out, that's where the elbow and the shoulder are going to follow. Now I find the best way to really see the difference between these two is the target test. I'm going to show you that here. Go to curves. I'll just create quickly two little curves. They don't have to be perfect. Say 90. A little bit smaller. And I'll duplicate one over here. Not to worry about naming them, they're just for a quick explanation. Move this guy in more, and this guy in more. So if we wanted to get our wrist joint in the center of each of their targets, how would we go about this with each system? Now, the FK system is going to take a little bit more time. We have to bend the shoulder here, and then bend the elbow. We see we're not really reaching it yet, so go back to the shoulder, bring it up. We overshot it, so now we got to go back to the elbow, That's close enough. You'll see in the IK system, it's a lot faster. Oops. Boom, and we're done. Very obviously, it's easy to see that the IK system is a lot faster than the FK system. I really like the IK system because it's fast. I really like using it for blocking an animation or just quickly getting something out to see where the timing, where the poses are going to be. It's really easy to use, especially for anything that requires like hand pushing, pulling, or gripping. And using the IK system for pushing and pulling, we'll see that let's pretend we're pulling this ring down. This hand here, we'll pretend this is our hand, is it's going to pull something down. You see how automatically the shoulder and the elbow follow suit. It looks very smooth and very natural. If you want to get that same effect over in our FK system, you have to adjust the elbow and then adjust the shoulder. And no matter what, this hand is not going to come out as smooth as this hand. You would have to almost key every single frame to get it to look like the IK system, and it still would be very jolty. It wouldn't exactly fit right. Now that's not to say that the IK system is overall better than the FK system, or vice versa. See, the IK system I really like using for blocking animations out. It's very fast, very effective. But when you want to get some little nuances into your animation or move things around in a certain way, like say I wanted this shoulder to come down fast, but then the elbow to really smoothly come down like this, and then once the shoulder got all the way down, I want the elbow to very quickly just like snap to the bottom. To get that with this IK system, you'd want to say, okay, if I want the shoulder to go down fast, I have to go like this, but now my hand is all the way out here, and I want it to come down like this. And see, you're always manipulating all three joints. So for me, IK system works well when you're trying to quickly block something out. The FK is really nice when you want to get things very specific to the way you want them to be, especially when adjusting speed and timing. Now, if you're creating your own rig or you're working with a rig that doesn't have the option to switch between the two, do not stress out over it. Both systems are perfectly fine. They both work absolutely perfectly. You just have to work with them enough to really get a nice, smooth, and clean animation. The more time you spend with each system, the more you'll begin to understand the difference between the two and which works better for the type of animation that you're doing. So if I was doing an animation that included any pushing or pulling, I would definitely lean more towards the IK system because it's more smooth and it focuses more on following the motions of the hand. It's good for animations that focus on the body and the way that they react to what the hand is doing. For me, like in a lip sync where the focus is mostly on the mouth and what the person is saying, the arms can always be used to show expression. So they're going to need a little bit more freedom to do different speeds and timings in their motion. So FK might be a little bit better for an acting performance. But that's all just my general opinion. Both can be used for any kind of animation and you will still get a clean, clear result. You just have to have some more experience working with both to find out which one works best for you. Next, we're going to talk about set-driven keys. Now, driven keys just creates an association between a pair of different attributes, where one value will affect or drive the value of another. Now, to demonstrate this, we've got a brand new scene, but we're in our animation menu this time. Let's quickly click on our rigging and just create another set of 3 joints. 1, 2, 3. Doesn't have to be perfect. And always, always, always name them. So we'll just quickly name this shoulder, elbow, and wrist. Now, like I said earlier, you never want to animate just the joints themselves. You always want to have them controlled by something else. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a driven key for the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. In order to do that, we need to first click on our shoulder, and we're going to go to Edit in our channel box, and you're going to say Add Attribute. Now what we want to do is we'll just call this shoulder down up, we'll say. We need to set its minimum and its maximum value. So as you can see over here, you can always set the rotate to be 0 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 if you wanted to. But for the sake of just this tutorial, we're only going to put the minimum at 0 and the max value that it can go up to will be 10. Go ahead and click OK. And now you see that on our shoulder joint, we have a brand new attribute called our shoulder down up. But right now it's not controlling anything. It goes all the way up to its maximum value, which is 10, and all the way down to its minimum, which is 0, but it's not affecting anything yet. And that's because we haven't loaded this as our driver to our shoulder joint as our driven. To do that, we're going to go up to Key and look down for Set Driven Key and go over to Set. In our Set Driven Key box here, we have our driver and our driven. So this attribute here is going to be our driver. It's going to be the one controlling the driven one, which is going to be our shoulder joint. So let's click on our shoulder down up. We'll load the driver. And then we click on the shoulder joint, and that's going to be loaded the driven. Now we want it so that what's controlling the shoulders, we'll say the rotate Z, which is going to be when you see here, bring the shoulder up and down. We want the shoulder rotate Z to be controlled by our shoulder down up here. So our shoulder down up is going to be our driver, and our shoulder rotate Z is going to be our driven. Now first we need to determine where we want our 0 to be. So let's say that we want 0 for our attribute to be, we'll just say also 0 on the Z. What we're going to do is make sure we have shoulder down up to 0 and key. Now you see that there's a little key on our rotate Z here. That just means that whenever the shoulder down up is at 0, this shoulder here will also be at 0. Now let's bring our shoulder down up to our maximum, which is 10, and we'll say that when the shoulder down up attribute is at 10, its maximum value, we want our shoulders to be all the way down here at, we'll say exactly negative 90 degrees. So 10 and negative 90 and key. Now when we control our shoulder down up, we can middle mouse drag left to right. We'll see at 0, it's at rotate Z, 0. And when it's all the way up at 10, we have our rotate Z at negative 90. We're no longer manipulating the joint itself. We're manipulating this attribute, the shoulder down up attribute, to control the joint. So now if you wanted to say we want the shoulder a little bit down, we'll bring it to about 5.5. And then you can always just key these things by key selected like that. So let's demonstrate this again, but instead with the elbow. So we're going to need to create a new attribute for the elbow. We'll say add attribute. We'll call this elbow underscore curl. Its minimum attribute, again, we'll just say 0 and its max is 10. And okay. Now we have our elbow curl. We're going to load that as our driver and our elbow joint as the driven. Let's say that the driver here is of course going to be our elbow curl attribute. And then what we want to be driven is, we'll say again, the rotate Z. So rotate Z. So when we're at 0 on our elbow curl, we want our elbow to be completely straight like this at 0. So we can actually go ahead and hit key. And then when our elbow curl is all the way up at 10, we want our elbow to be completely curled up. Big strong man. We'll say 98. And then we can go ahead and key that. So now our elbow curl is going to be controlling our rotate Z here. So all the way down to 0, it's completely straight. All the way back up to 10, it's at 98. So we got a nice elbow curl. Now, the wrist here we're not going to do because it doesn't have any hand attached to it. But you could do the exact same thing. Say that if you went to edit, add attribute, we'll say wrist curl. And we could set the minimum and the maximum. We could go ahead and do that, and we'll just say that for our driver, driven, we'll say that it's also rotate Z, and we would just say that, you know, at 0 we'll keep the hand completely straight like this, key it, but say that when we went all the way up to 10, that the wrist was then pointed down like that at, we'll say negative 50. And we could key that. And you're not going to see anything right now because there's no hand or anything connected to this end joint. Really, you wouldn't even put any animation on an end joint like this. But just for the sake of this tutorial, you could also do that and see that the exact same thing happens. You can see in our channel box here that when wrist curl is all the way down to 0, the rotate Z is all the way down at 0, and if you bring it all the way up to 10, it's at -50. So it is affecting the wrist joint. We're just not going to see anything in our viewport here because there's nothing else connected to the wrist. Right now our wrist is our end joint, so you're not going to see anything really beautiful happen there. So now you have all of your set driven keys, and it's actually really great to use these for very simple rig setups. I actually use set driven keys in my own projects. I even have it on my ladybug rig where to lift up the shell I have a set driven key. So say that this was part of the shell that we needed to lift up, that at elbow curl would be shell down, but all the way up at 10 it would be shell up, and imagine that we would have the ladybug shell here going down and up. For me, I like set-driven keys because it takes away the mess of having to set up a whole FK or IK system for something that's very simple. But I actually really like set-driven keys. I find that it's very easy to set up, and it's actually pretty effective. So let's say that this was our arm, and we wanted him to bend his elbow. We'll just bring his shoulder down, but curl his elbow and be like, hey, hello, look how strong I am. Very strong, very friendly, waving hello. So as you guys saw, set-driven keys is very simple, very easy. It takes almost no time at all to set up, but it's actually pretty effective. But next I want to go over blend shapes. Let's go ahead and open a new scene, and then we're going to talk about how to create a blend shape. Now, in the past, what a blend shape meant was you would have an original geometry, let's say like a regular sphere like this. But to create a blend shape, instead of rigging this whole sphere, we wanted to create a blend shape. So instead, we would duplicate the sphere, we would say deform this one to whatever we wanted it to look like, maybe give them a good old stretch. And then we would set a blend shape controller, like an attribute, almost like a set-driven key that would say, when I say stretch, I want this sphere to look like this sphere over here. But here in Maya 2017, blend shapes don't really work this way anymore, and it's actually a lot easier. Instead of having to create 20 different heads or 20 different spheres to make this original one look like all the other ones, you can actually just create the one. We no longer need all the extra spheres. So let's start with sphere 1. We're just going to name this as our original, we'll call it a head. We'll just pretend it's a head. Next, where you want to go is up to Windows, Animation Editor, and Shape Editor. Now this is new to Maya 2017. First, what we need to do is create a blend shape. So let's click on our sphere and say Create Blend Shape. This is going to be the group in which all of our blend shapes sit within. So we're just going to call this, let's say, expressions. If you wanted to put a bunch of different expressions on your head, like happy, sad, whatever. But to create a blend shape, to make this geometry look like another geometry without having to rig it, we're going to go ahead and add a target. Now this target is actually what in the past we would call the blend shape. So let's name this one Stretch. Now with Edit on, we can actually manipulate this same geometry to be its own blend shape. What's really fantastic about Maya 2017 is we have all of these sculpting tools that were brought in from Mudbox that we can actually use to sculpt on this sphere. So let's say that we wanted to stretch this sphere. We wanted it to almost be like a squash and stretch. So we'll go over to this one here. This is called the Bulge Tool. And we can just kind of bulge it out a little bit. You'll see I do have symmetry on. You can just double click on whatever tool it is and click on the symmetry. You can even turn symmetry off, but I have mine on the y-axis right now, just so that it's easier to have a little bit of equal manipulation here. And we're just going to sculpt him all the way up. Now if you hold down the B key on your keyboard and left click, you can make that area for the bulge bigger or smaller. And if you hold down M as in manipulation, you can control the weight or how strong that manipulation is. So let's go ahead and just sculpt out very quickly this bulge. We'll say that this is an equal stretch. Yeah, we'll just say that. That's too much. We'll just say that here. We'll make this area bigger. And we'll just really bulge him out. There, that's a lovely stretched out sphere in a way. Maybe we'll go over to our smooth tool and smooth them out a little bit. just to make him look pretty. There we go. He looks a little bit better now. Just a little bit. Whatever. It's for demonstration. So now that we have our stretch, we'll call this is our stretch blend shape. We want our original sphere that as we manipulate this controller here, this attribute, we want our original sphere to now look like this little stretched out monstrosity. So once you have a shape that you like, you go ahead and click off of this edit key, turn it back to gray, and then you'll see when you move this driver, our original sphere goes between its blend shape to its stretched form. It's as simple as that. Instead of in the past Maya, like 2016 and 2015, when you wanted to create a blend shape, you would have to create a whole nother sphere and then manipulate it to look like that stretched mesh. You can now manipulate that original sphere to also be its own blend shapes. This is actually a lot more efficient, it's a lot faster, and you don't have to worry about disconnecting a head from the body to create different expressions on blend shapes for the eyes and then just the mouth or the nose. It can all be on just one mesh in one place, and you don't have to worry about going between all these different geometries and keeping them organized. Now let's go ahead and add another blend shape. It's now called Add Target. So let's add another target. We'll call this one Squish. Squash. Squish Squash. And now same thing, with our edit on, here on red, we can now manipulate this geometry to be squashed. So, I don't know, maybe I'll use this one. It's the flatten tool. We'll just make him look like he's flattened out. Just flatten him out a little bit. Ugh, looks like a deflated beach ball. That's too much. Let's be nicer. Let's just give him a little bit of flat. Just a little bit of nice flattening out. Aw. He looks so sad. That's okay. There. He looks like a deflated beach ball. But we'll call that our squash. So again, you can always play with the rest of these sculpting tools and make it look perfect. For the sake of demonstration, I'm happy with deflated beach ball squash. So let's click off our edit. It now also squashes. Now, the coolest thing with blend shapes, the pièce de résistance. Forgive that I can't speak French, but the best part about blend shapes is that I can stretch him, but also squash him like this at the same time without having to create a whole rigging setup for one sphere. I can say, you know what, I want him a little bit more squished, but I also still want him stretched at the top. You can have both things, because with your blend shapes, it will always find the median between the two if you're using more than one manipulator. So let's say that at frame 1, we're going to shift select both of these, right click and key, and now we have a keyframe for both of these attributes. But let's say we get to frame 10 and we want it to be super, we'll say super stretched out, all the way to 1. We'll key that guy, we'll keep squash on 0. Let's say we go to 20, we'll bring them both back down to 0. Key them both again. And then up to 30, we want them super squished. We'll just key those really quick. But say when we get to 40, we want them also to be all the way stretched. So just a couple of different versions of having both of these together. So if we go all the way back to our frame 1, we have frame 10 where we're super stretched out. We have frame 20 where he's back to normal. Frame 30 where he's super squished. And all the way up to 40 where he's a little bit of both. So this is really cool because you can always manipulate the one mesh to look like 20 different meshes like you'd have to do in the past with your blend shapes. But now you only need one geometry to make multiple blend shapes all underneath this one shape editor. Now you might be asking, Amber, how can I still manipulate this animation if I'm putting the keyframes on blend shapes? Well, let's go back up to Windows, Animation Editors, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to our graph editor. In our graph editor, you can see that these expressions are still visible, that you can still manipulate this just like any other keyframe. So say that we wanted these to be, I don't know, we'll clamp them or we'll spline them. We'll just manipulate them a little bit. We'll say like, let's give them a big difference. We'll just make it crazy. But at the end, we want it to go a little bit faster. We do that. Let's say the squash, we wanted to be, I don't know, for some absurd reason, you wanted it to be step tangents. Yep, that's still going to manipulate the animation. You see how now it's moving quite differently than it was before. So yeah, even if you're using blend shapes and you're still putting the keyframes on these expressions here, it's still going to show up in your graph editor. You can still manipulate it just like any other animation. Particularly, blend shapes are good for facial animations. So if, say that instead of a sphere, you have a really awesome face model. It's got perfect typology right around the mouth, and the eyes, and the nose. You can even just use blend shapes to scrunch the nose. You could say that instead of stretch, say it would be smile, and you would make the mouth smile. And the next one would be frown, and you could make the mouth frown. There's endless possibilities when using blend shapes. I definitely encourage you to use blend shapes if you can. Just like the set-driven keys, you don't have to go around and mess with any sort of joints or IK, FK setups or setting a bunch of different controllers. All you have to do is just create the blend shape, and then you can just key the expression here itself and animate that instead of having to worry about different joint setups for something that doesn't really require a joint. You would not really see joints used in a face anyhow. So I would definitely lean more towards blend shapes or set-driven keys for your animations. That is, for something that's really not an arm or a leg that doesn't really require joints. Things that are more geometry-based, like facial expressions. I definitely think that blend shapes are a lot of fun to use. I know that a lot of people really like using them for all their different animations, for facial expressions, maybe just to have fun, especially when you're doing just like a typical bouncing ball. So you can see it's under the inputs here, our expressions. Squash and stretch. It's popular to use blend shapes even just for a typical bouncing ball animation. Like you saw that I could put the squash and stretch in the ball here and animate that rather than saying putting a NURBS curve on it and manipulating it that way. I hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial video. Remember, we covered FK versus IK, we covered set-driven keys, and our blend shapes. If you guys have any more questions, you can always comment on this video or send me an email at info@TCAmber.com or visit my website, TCAmber.com, and go over to the contact tab, and you can always message me through there also. Remember, I'll always be posting these tutorials on my website under the blog and posting them on my LinkedIn. You can always share them with your friends and family. And if you have a video of your own that you'd like to make, I absolutely encourage you to make one. No matter what the skill is, no matter how simple you think it is, there are always people out there ready to learn and ready to hear from you. I absolutely 100% encourage you guys to share whatever information you have with others. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is TCAmber, and I'll see you in the very next video. Bye now.